Week 8 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few wide receivers I looked at off the wire this week. The first receiver, Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. So maybe it's finally getting going with Keon Coleman, where now he don't have to be the number one wide receiver in theory for this team, where the best corner covers him with Amari Cooper with the Buffalo Bills and found the end zone in his debut. And Keon Coleman, we know he was a big play wide receiver in college. We know they got him in the second round. Is this Buffalo Bill team? In the last 2 out of 3 games, he's actually got double-digit fantasy points. Week 5 at Houston, a catch, 49 yards, a touchdown. Week 6 at the Jets, 3 catches, 26 yards. And Week 7 versus the Titans, a big game, 4 catches, 125 yards, and 7 targets. So the 3 receiver sets, obviously, they were Amari Cooper, Khalil Shakir, and Keon Coleman. And we know Josh Allen's a quarterback, one of the best in the league. Going to spread that football out. And we saw Keon Coleman have his best game and more consistent game of his NFL career. Like I said, now he's not going to draw many number 1 corners or number 2 corners on rosters, where he's going to be more in the slot and more comfortable with Cooper being that number 1 wide receiver. So Coleman there this week available in 68% of fantasy leagues. The next wide receiver is Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. So we know someone had to step up for this Cleveland Brown team with Amari Cooper traded away, and now with Watson out for the season with the torn Achilles. Cedric Tillman, he was the number 1 guy over there for this Cleveland Brown team, and we'll see if it's Thompson Robinson or Jameis Winston in next week's game. But this Brown team, you know, they're going to be trailing early and often, and they're going to go with the younger guys. So Tillman, a draft pick a couple seasons ago for this Brown team, and now getting an opportunity, and he had a nice breakout performance in Week 7 versus the Bengals. 8 catches, 81 yards, and a 2-point conversion on 12 targets. So this week, a good matchup versus the Baltimore Ravens. 3rd most fantasy points to wideouts on the season. And you know, this Brown team, they're going to be trailing early and often, most likely, once again in this ball game, and they're going to have to throw nonstop. So while Tillman's out there virtually in every league at 99%, he's definitely an ad this week. Next ad, Jalen Tolbert of the Dallas Cowboys. Cowboys won by this week, and Tolbert, the number 2 wide receiver in this passing game, obviously with CeeDee Lamb, number 1, and Brandon Cooks, who's been out now for the last few weeks. And a tough matchup, no doubt about it, coming up at San Francisco in Week 8. So this season, 3 out of 6 games, double-digit fantasy points for Tolbert in PPR leagues, out there in 80% of leagues. In the last few games, Week 4 at the Giants, 3 catches, 24 yards. Week 5 at the Steelers, 7 catches, 87 yards, touchdown. And Week 6 versus the Lions, 4 catches, 43 yards. So like I said, the bye week's over now for Tolbert and this Cowboy team. Brandon Cook still a few games away from getting activated. But this Cowboy team, to be honest, with a tough schedule coming up, and the Eagles and Commanders obviously playing well, I think it's going to be tough for them to make the playoffs. And maybe they got to go with a youth movement. I know they put in a lot of money with Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, but besides those 2 players, I would go with the younger guys and see what they got at this point. So Tolbert out there in 80% of fantasy leagues, and we've seen some decent flashes from him so far this season. Next receiver, Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers. Debo, he left early in that game with illness, went to the locker room. We didn't see him the rest of the way versus Kansas City in Week 7. And then Brandon Ayuk just took a massive hit on his knee, and he got carted off out for the season. So Pearsall just coming back off the IR himself after obviously getting shot in the chest in preseason and right before the season. He's out there in 87% of fantasy leagues. And him and Jawan Jennings are going to be the 2 players that are going to have to step up, especially if Brandon Ayuk is out now for the San Francisco 49er team. So Pearsall, in his first career ball game, 3 catches, 21 yards on 5 targets. Definitely a tough matchup. But Week 8, it's an easier one here versus the Dallas Cowboys, where they've been torched all season long for the most part versus pretty viable offenses. So Pearsall, like I said, he's out there in tons of leagues at 87%. And now with Ayuk, or the whole season, Pearsall and Jawan Jennings are going to be the 2 wide receivers that have to step up for the San Francisco 49er team. Next receiver is his teammate, mentioned Jawan Jennings of the 49ers. I know he's out in last week's game with a hip injury. I know Jennings most likely has more upside than Pearsall, where we saw early in the season he popped off for the monster ball game in Week 3. 11 catches, 175 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Obviously, Jennings, a veteran, knows this offense a whole lot. We know he's capable of going out there and having big games, like I just mentioned in Week 3. And he's got 3 games out of 6 that he's appeared in this season with double-digit fantasy points. So right now, out there in 71% of fantasy leagues, and Jennings, he's going to move right into the starting lineup, with Pierce will be more of a slot and a 3rd wide receiver for the San Francisco 49er team. But like I said, Pearsall's healthy right now. That's why I mentioned him before Jennings. But if Jennings could get the hip right and get back on the field here in Week 8 versus the Dallas Cowboys. Even though it wouldn't be surprising to me if they sit him out one more week with the bye in Week 9, then Jennings is a go. But right now, if you need help with the wide receiver position, and you've got spots for both these players, the move for them this week. Next receiver, Bub Means of the New Orleans Saints. Shaheed out for the season for this New Orleans Saints team. Chris Olave, he was concussed, and he missed last week's ball game versus the Denver Broncos. And Bub Means, so far, he's had opportunity the last couple weeks. Week 6 versus Tampa Bay, 5 catches, 45 yards, a touchdown, 8 targets. In Week 7, in that blowout loss versus the Broncos, 3 catches, 37 yards. So I know Valdez-Scantlin's coming in for a visit with this New Orleans Saints team, but at this point of his career, he's not much of a threat, even if they do sign him to a deal, is Valdez-Scantlin. And like I said, this team, they might trade off some pieces at the deadline. 2-5 now, started off 2-0. Derek Carr banged up. Alvin Kamara still has a lot of money left on his contract. We'll see if they try to get him off the books. Is this New Orleans Saints team, if they think they're going nowhere this season. Bub Means and the next receiver, Cedric Wilson of the New Orleans Saints, out there 99% of fantasy leagues, and he had a good ball game. 6 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown on 7 targets in an expanded role. So many seasons ago, he had a breakout year with the Dallas Cowboys. Then he signed with the Miami Dolphins, didn't do much there. And now he merged with this New Orleans Saints team, and his best game in many years it was for him versus the Denver Broncos in Week 7. So Week 8, a decent matchup at the Chargers in Week 9 at Carolina. And we know this team, they're trying to fill in for Rashid Shaheed, who's out for the season after he got off to a hot start early in the year for this New Orleans Saints team. So right now, Wilson out there 99% of fantasy leagues. I don't think he's really going to do much, but after seeing someone coming off a 17.70 fantasy day in PPR leagues, and also with Shaheed out for the season, someone to definitely keep an eye on and take a flyer on. And the final wide receiver I looked at off the wise, McCole Hardman of the Kansas City Chiefs. Juju Smith-Schuster, he left the game early with the hamstring injury. And we know Smith-Schuster going into the week, he was banged up with the hammy, and he couldn't compete and finish the ball game. So Hardman out there, 99% of fantasy leagues. And this receiving core is obviously decimated. Hollywood Brown hurt since the preseason, out for the year. Rashee Rice out for the season with the knee injury, got the surgery. He's finished. And then we saw now Juju Smith-Schuster go down. So they're down to Xavier Worthy, McCole Hardman on this offense, Sky Moore, Justin Watson. So not a lot of good pieces at the wide receiver position for this Kansas City Chiefs team. Hardman, we know he's been there for many years, even though he was with the Jets with a cup of coffee last season, came back with Kansas City, and now he's going to get an opportunity. Once again, he is McCole Hardman to get some reasonable snaps and make plays. So with a good matchup coming up with the Raiders, and like I said, he's getting targets and looks now in this offense with Juju banged up. He's an ad this week, so that's a few wide receivers I looked at off the wire for Week 8 of the fantasy football season.